Oh boy, I sure am excited for today, because it is the only day out of the year where it is socially acceptable to traumatize children. But also today's topic. That's right, for Halloween we're going to take a little look at Roman ghost stories. Now, the Romans, like all ancient people, were very superstitious and had all kinds of spirits and folklores around them, but we're sticking with the more spooky stories that have been documented by some ancient writers. And not stories from fictionary literary works, I'm talking about stories that were presented as real by the authors. But before we begin, I gotta mention, while most of this video is just based on the primary ancient texts themselves, I did get some extra info from the book Haunted Greece and Rome, Ghost Stories from Classical Antiquity by Debbie Felton. So you want to read more about this stuff, then there's that. Now let's start. Our first story comes from a letter that Pliny the Elder wrote to his friend and associate, Lucius Licinius Sura, sometime in the late 1st century AD. In the letter, Pliny asks Sura if he believes in ghosts, or if he thinks they're an illusion from fear. Pliny then says he somewhat believes in them after hearing about several different stories of supernatural encounters. The letter then goes over each of them. However, we're only going to focus on one specific story here, since it's both the most detailed and spooky. The story goes that somewhere in Athens, there was a large roomy house that was kept perpetually vacant and unable to properly sell or be rented to anyone, because it was said that anyone that stayed there would at night hear the sounds of clanking chains get closer and closer until a ghostly apparition appeared near them. The ghost was described as looking like a dirty, emaciated old man with a long beard and with chain shackles around his arms and legs that would make loud clanking noises as he moved around. And supposedly, the sheer fear this caused people would make them lose sleep each night until they slowly died from sleep deprivation and illness. So, for who knows how long, the house stayed functionally abandoned. Until one day, a philosopher named Athenodorus came to Athens, and saw the house being advertised for rent. But, seeing how low the price was for a house this size, he figured it was a bit sketchy, so he asked why, and learned about the ghost's reputation. Now, Athenodorus was a skeptical man, but a curious one, and decided he was going to check out this infamous spooky house. So, Athenodorus, in true Greco-Roman fashion, got his slaves to set up a couch, writing tablets, and a lamp, and decided to stay up into the night to see if anything strange would happen. He figured if the ghost legend was fake, then keeping his mind busy with his writings would prevent him from imagining stuff. And before night, he sent all his slaves to some other part of the house so he would be alone. At first, the night went normally, silent, nothing. But at some point, in the night, he started to hear the clanking of chains and the sounds of metal being dragged around the house, slowly getting closer and closer. At first, he just tried to ignore the noises and return to his writings, until he heard the metal sounds in the room with him. He turned around and saw the ghost, just as described. But the ghost didn't attack him, but instead motioned with his finger to come closer. Athenodorus simply motioned his hand back to the ghost to wait, then went back to his writings. The ghost just continued to make noise and started to rattle his chains over Athenodorus' head, until he finally got up and decided to follow the ghost. He followed until they reached the house courtyard, then suddenly the ghost disappeared. Athenodorus decided to mark the spot on the ground where the ghost disappeared, and the next day he went to the local magistrates and told them they should excavate around the marked spot in the courtyard. When they did, they found a skeleton wrapped in chains. They then took the remains and gave them the proper burial rites and rituals, and from then on, the ghost sightings stopped in the house. Now wasn't that a fun twist, eh? This story is definitely one of the most famous ancient paranormal tales, and is very similar to a fictional parody story told by the famous 2nd century AD satirist Lucian of Samosata. In his version, the story follows the same theme of a philosopher renting a cheap, allegedly haunted house, and then waiting for the ghost. But in Lucian's version, the house isn't in Athens, but in Corinth. Instead, the ghost does outright attack and kill people. And the story ends with the philosopher fighting off the ghost with some Egyptian spells. They eventually dig up bones on the property and laid them to rest, putting an end to the haunting. This suggests one of two things. Either the Lucian story is directly parodying Pliny's story, which would require him to have access to his personal letters many decades later, or his story and Pliny's were based on existing urban legends that were floating around. And in my personal opinion, I think the urban legend connection seems most likely, since Pliny didn't read about his story, he said he heard it from someone. And the philosopher Athenodorus in question, while not having his identity 100% determined, was most likely one of two different Stoic Greek philosophers from the 1st century BC, either Athenodonius of Canana or Athenodonius Cordylion. But regardless of who, this places the original story a century before Pliny wrote about it, so who knows what urban legends about it developed in that time. But anyways, next story. Now, for the most part, poltergeist-like ghosts are not really a thing in Greco-Roman stories or folklore, but there's at least one story that is pretty damn close. It comes from Roman writer Suetonius in 121 AD, and it's from his 12 Caesars historical biography series of books, specifically the book about Emperor Augustus. Now, I do have to preface this with saying that while the 12 Caesars series is mostly an historical recount of the lives of the imperial families, it is, though, filled with many unverified rumors and hearsay stories with little proof, so take that into account. Now, the story itself is quite short, and essentially goes: during Emperor Augustus' early days as an infant, in the villa his grandfather owned just outside Valentry, there was a small room used as his nursery. However, it is rumored this room had some kind of hostile presence. So severe, in fact, no one dared enter the room unless absolutely necessary or without some kind of cleansing ritual. Because otherwise, people who went into the room were attacked by an unknown force and sent into a state of shock and terror. Suetonius then says these rumors were supposedly proven true, since not long ago, the new owner of the villa decided to test this legend by sleeping in the room. But when he went to bed, he was forcibly dragged from his bed and thrown out of the room along with his bed sheets. He was then found on the floor in a state of shock and terror. And that's all Suetonius says about the haunted villa. But it's definitely one of the most interesting ones, since unlike most of the other stories, this was not far removed from Suetonius' own time, and may have even been contemporary to him in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. But he doesn't give an exact date on when this final story happened, only saying it was recent. But this story is strange as well, because Suetonius never says when the ghost room thing started, so if it just always existed since the time of Augustus, then why the hell were they keeping a baby in it, Lamau? However, it's possible the legend only started after Augustus, and it's really funny to imagine if the ghost attacking people is Augustus himself, lol. Okay, moving on to the next story. This story was written by Phlegon of Tralles sometime during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD. The story is from the Book of Marbles, which immediately makes it suspicious, since the Book of Marbles can really be best described as the ancient equivalent to a tabloid newspaper, as in, it's just bizarre and outlandish stories presented as real. This includes many different paranormal and wacky stories, so the book is mostly just Phlegon compiling random interesting stories he had heard about. But how much of it he personally believed himself is debatable, but he does source some stuff, including the story we're about to cover. Unfortunately, the Book of Marbles hasn't survived completely, and the story we're going to cover literally starts mid-sentence because the beginning part is lost. But luckily, a short summarized version was retold by 4th century AD philosopher Proclus Lachius, so now we can reasonably piece together the whole thing. The story supposedly takes place during the 4th century BC, specifically during the reign of King Philip II of Macedon in the city of Amphipolis. The story goes that a girl named Philinion was newlywed to a man named Cratorios, possibly the same Cratorios who was later a general in Alexander the Great's army, but his exact identity here isn't important, since soon after Philinion died. Then flash forward 6 months. A young man from Pella named Machates was living in Philinion's parents' house, and each night a mysterious girl would come visit him in his room. But one night, one of the family nurses looked into Machates' room and saw the girl sitting next to him. The mysterious girl looked exactly like Philinion, so the nurse immediately rushed to the parents' room, screaming for them to wake up and telling them that their daughter magically returned from the dead. The mother, hearing about this impossible news, immediately passed out. But after eventually waking up, she was upset at the nurse and thought she was crazy. The girl couldn't be her daughter. It was impossible. She was dead and buried. But with enough convincing, the mother agreed to take a look. But by now, 2 hours had passed since the nurse saw the girl, so when the mother went to peek into the room, they were both sleeping, so she couldn't determine who the girl was exactly. But the mother agreed she did look similar to her daughter. So she decided to confront the girl in the morning. But when she went into the room the next day, the girl was gone. So she confronted Machates and asked him to tell her everything that happened. He told her the girl's name was Philinion, and she had been visiting him without her parents knowing, since her desire for him was so strong. To prove her existence, Makates showed the mother the gold ring and breastband she had left behind. The mother, seeing this proof, immediately broke down crying in grief, reliving her memories of her daughter. So Makates told her to calm down and said he can show her the girl tonight when she arrives. The family agreed, and when night came, Philinion did arrive as usual. But Makates was now suspicious and curious about the whole situation, so while they ate and drank together, he secretly told one of his slaves to bring the parents into the room now. Both her parents came into the room, and upon seeing the girl, were in shock and speechless. They then tried to embrace her, but Philinion would then say to them,
"Mother and father, how unfairly you have grudged my being with the guests for 3 days in my father's house, since I have caused no one any pain. For this reason, on account of your meddling, you shall grieve all over again, and I shall return to the place appointed for me, for it was not without divine will that I came here."
After saying this, she would immediately drop dead, and her parents had a loud crying breakdown for the rest of the night. But news of the situation quickly spread across the city, and crowds started to form outside the house. And by the next day, a local city official named Hipparchus was called to deal with the crowds and situation. It was decided they would go to the tomb of Philinion and see if she was actually really dead or not. But when they opened it, her corpse was gone, and all that was there was an iron ring and wine cup she had gotten from Makates. Now freaked out and shocked, they went to her parents' house to see if her body was really there. And when they saw her corpse in the room as described, they immediately called the city assembly to figure out what to do. After some discussion, it was eventually decided they would burn her body outside the city and perform several different rituals and sacrifices to the gods, and everyone should perform a cleansing ritual on themselves as well. But after everything, Makates would end up offing himself anyways. The story ends with Hipparchus telling a man named Aridius, who managed the city for King Philip, if he will report the incident to the king. Now, wasn't that dramatic? But I'm sure you have a few questions. But first, let me explain how the story supposedly came to be. The entire story is told from the perspective of Hipparchus, writing this as a letter to Aridius. And these letters, several centuries later, were then supposedly catalogued by a man named Namachius of Epirus, presumably sometime in the 1st century BC or AD. And from these catalogs, Phlegon got the story. So there's several layers of separation from Phlegon and 400 years earlier. But anyways, you might be wondering why the town torched her corpse and decided to mass cleanse themselves, despite Philinion not doing anything clearly evil. Well, the most common theory for why is that Philinion is linked to the Greek concept of a lamia, or something similar, which was a kind of evil demon that supposedly seduces and eats men. And even though it's not explicitly said, it may not have needed to be explained, since from the perspective of the intended Greco-Roman audience, it was just known. Especially since stories of dead people returning were broadly seen as a bad sign in the ancient world. Now, for a kind of analysis of the people involved in the story, Professor William Hansen argues the names mentioned are derived from real, more well-known figures, Cratorius being the same Cratorius as the general, like I mentioned earlier, and Aridius being the same as Philip Aridius, the half-brother of Alexander the Great. Then the name Philinion, coming from Phila, the name of Cratorius' second wife, and Philina of Lauressa, the mother of Philip Aridius. This combination of semi-real stuff or people into a kind of historical narrative was quite common in Greek literature. So, we can safely assume this is just another fictional story that took details from the real world for whatever purpose. Well, next story. The final story for today comes from the 1st century AD philosopher and priest Plutarch, specifically a random story involving a haunted bathhouse, from his Parallel Lives biography series on different major figures. So I need to put in the little citation that this book by Plutarch is not meant to be a 100% exact historical recount of events, but more a kind of moral character analysis of different people. However, that doesn't mean he was outright making stuff up, but rather he wasn't going into the more verifiable historical specifics on many stories. But with that said, let's see what spooky things supposedly happened. The story takes place in Plutarch's home city of Caronia, sometime in the past, and although he does not say exactly when, we can reasonably infer a time period from some details, but we'll get to that later. It was said in Caronia there was an orphan boy named Damon, who was described as incredibly beautiful, but he was also very harsh and violent, from his time growing up on the streets. Well, one day, a Roman army was stationed for the winter at Caronia, and the army commander saw the beautiful Damon and decided he wanted that twink ass. So, he tried to woo Damon and give him presents and such, but Damon didn't care for the commander at all and kept telling him no. So, the commander started using threats of violence against Damon to give in. Well, our hardened street twink wasn't having that, so one night, he conspired with his friends to kill the commander. He got 16 of his friends to all cover their faces in black soot, get plastered on wine for courage. Then at daybreak, they found the commander at the city marketplace and stabbed him to death, then fled the city. Well, the city officials were understandably horrified, but not so much about the murder itself, but rather the hell the city would have to pay once Rome finds out they killed an officer. So the city officials quickly gathered in the assembly and condemned Damon and his friends to death, and sent their details of the event to Roman officials. However, Damon and gang weren't done, because when all the city officials gathered to dine together in the town hall, Damon and his men burst into the room and killed them all before fleeing the city again. Sometime not long afterwards, the Roman commander Lucius Licinius Lucullus came to the city to investigate the situation, and after seeing everything, decided the city itself had done what was right, and should face no greater punishment for the murder. So while the city was now safe, Damon was still out in the countryside, now apparently raiding farms and stuff. So the city devised a plan to lure him back. They said they would drop the murder charges and appoint him as the gymnasiarch, which is a kind of manager of the city gym facilities, but anyways, so Damon returned. But as he was being appointed at the bathhouse, he was quickly stabbed to death. But that's not where the story ends, since afterwards, people would report seeing apparitions and the sounds of groans in the bathhouse. It got so bad, the city eventually walled off the bathhouse entrance, but supposedly, to this day, people still report hearing strange and frightening noises coming from the empty bathhouse. Now, wasn't that a dramatic tale? For as when this story supposedly took place, our best way to figure that out is to just look at the name of the Roman commander, Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Now there's a bunch of people by this name, but since he's in Greece, we know this must have taken place after the Roman conquest, so it's safe to assume this could be the famous General Lucullus, so this places the story sometime in the 1st century BC. And I don't know what to really make of the story, since Plutarch goes on to talk about Lucullus and afterwards then compares him to the Athenian general Chimaeon. But as for Damon, if his story is based on real events, then I assume it got dramatized over the century gap between him and Plutarch. And with that, that's all the time we have for this spooky video, so if you found this as interesting as I did, then be sure to like and subscribe for future shenanigans, and happy Halloween.